I'm Mike.
I'm Jason.
Welcome to Snake Envy. So, as a breeder, do you give people care sheets? Or do people ask for care sheets?
Occasionally, yeah. I don't have one wrote up myself, but...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of makes my point a little bit. I've been saying for a long time, I think care sheets have done more harm than good, in a way. Keeping snakes, or any animal for that matter, there's the X's and O's of it, but there's also an art to it.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
And I, as a care sheet, there's a few things that you really need. You need some temperatures. That's important. Water, simple care stuff, but a lot of it can be out of proportion.
Well, I treat a care sheet as a starting point. And then from there, your individual animal is going to tell you whether it's happy or not.
Totally. You learn.
Yeah.
And you start, I like this and I like that. And
yeah. And they may not all be the same. You could have a half dozen king snakes, and you're going to have one that doesn't like what the other five like.
Correct.
So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the art of keeping snakes, and I kind of feel like that part of the hobby isn't really being taught like it used to because of care sheets and because of the internet. But I had an early mentor who taught me something called observe and adjust, O and A. And I use it to this day. It's kind of my Bible for keeping snakes. But it sounds like exactly what it is. You observe your snake's behavior, and based on that, it tells you whether your husbandry needs some adjusting.
Yeah, and as a breeder, I've learned the hard way.
Yeah.
I just figured all snakes, you just make a nest box when you breed them, and I started working with some North American milks and some of these smaller species, and I would just put a nest box, and they would crawl in there, and it's big and open up on top. There is a 2-inch layer or whatever of vermiculite or whatever substrate you're using for a nest box or a lay box. And then I figured, I observed and watched milk snakes crawl under their lay box because it was more secure. It was tighter, and they felt better. And so then I started adding green moss, and so they could crawl and tunnel through that on the top of the layers of vermiculite. And so, that's one example I had to learn the hard way.
Yeah, you observe their behavior and you make an adjustment based on it. And it's the same way pretty much for all husbandry. But we're just going to talk about a few examples of, what your snake may be trying to tell you. We were joking before we started filming because I was telling Jason I had a snake last year. Got her enclosure set up and everything after I moved her into a bigger one. And I had 2 different style hides in her enclosure because I thought it looked good. And it did. It looked great. But what I noticed is she was spending the majority of her time in the one hide and not the other. It was the warm hide that she wasn't using. So even after a meal, she wouldn't go into her warm hide. She would stay down in the other one. And then the few times I did catch her over there, she would be behind that hide. She wouldn't be in it.
Just using it as a fence.
But she was using it as a hide, but more of a barrier rather than going in it. And my first instinct was, maybe in the new setup, it's a little warmer over there. She must be too warm on that warm end of the enclosure. But the day before, I had noticed her behind it. So I said, well, on a whim, I'm going to trade that hide with one of the other snakes and give her 2 of the same. And then the plan is later that evening or tomorrow or the next day, I was going to adjust the temps. Well, guess what? It took about 2 hours, and she was down in her
2 hours, and she's like, oh, I'm home.
And so this poor snake's probably just been waiting. Can you not tell? I don't like that hide.
Give me what I need.
Give me what I want. And so it's a simple thing like that. But the fact that she was spending all of her time at the other end of the enclosure, ideally a snake's not doing that. So whether it's temperatures, whether it's something simple like the hide being different, they should be utilizing all of their enclosure. Now, it's not always going to be a perfect 50-50, but your goal is to be seeing your snake going back and forth.
Yeah.
Thermoregulating. So that's a clue that something's off if your snake is spending all of its time. So talk about temperature a little bit in that scenario where it's always at one end.
I mean, yeah, they could just like the temperature on one end more than, that could be the case. Or it could be just they're more comfortable with, like you said, like this hide makes them feel more comfortable and more secure. We've talked about temperatures a lot, and a big variance in there. I do have snakes that like certain hides, and they hardly ever come out of them. But then you can tell they came out and hunted. They came out and looked for food, and they make their little trails around the edges and make their path and do their laps or whatever.
And that's a good point. You're not always going to see them. A lot of people get kind of panicked and say, well, I never see my snake at that end of the enclosure. But take a look at your substrate, and they could be over there when you're asleep
at nighttime,
and you don't always see it.
I have a lot of snakes that are active at night,
and they'll head over to that warm hide at night, but they're not over there so much during the day. So there's a lot of clues. We have talked about knowing your snake room and knowing that it's warmer up at the ceiling than it is at the floor. It could be warmer or cooler on an outside wall. If you've got a window with direct sun hitting one of your enclosures, if you have a heating or air conditioning vent that's blowing on some of your enclosures but not the others, there's a lot of reasons why a snake might be favoring one end of the enclosure over the other. But it's a clue that something's not entirely right. One of my favorite things I see on snake groups on social media is, my husbandry is spot on, but... And the but is always followed by a problem. The snake's not eating, or the snake's always at one end of the enclosure. Well, okay, so for that individual snake, your husbandry is not spot on.
It's not perfect.
No, it wants you to change something. What's another behavior that you notice and you say, oh, okay, this snake's not entirely happy?
Well, sometimes snakes won't eat.
Yes,
and
eating's a big one.
Like, the snake is not eating, and like, I'll change it into a new rack or a new spot in the rack. I'll go up or down a few degrees, might make it feel better. Some hides they don't like, certain hides, and
they're uncomfortable. When they're uncomfortable, they don't eat. So there's two main methods of keeping for the hobbyist. For breeders, it's a little different, but you've got ambient keeping, where you're basically adjusting the room temp, and every enclosure is basically in a similar environment. And then there's enclosure keeping, where you've got heat sources in the enclosures. Every enclosure theoretically could be a little different environment. It's amazing that in an ambient situation, you might just need to move the guy that's up near the ceiling down low and swap places with the other snake, and you might find at that point they're both happy.
Well, and I've had snakes, like, a lot of the stuff I sell, I don't like have hides in them and stuff. And there's sometimes where the snake won't eat, and I'll throw a little hide in there, and then it eats. Like, it's simple as that sometimes.
Yeah. Just
giving it somewhere to take shelter.
Yeah. Defensive behavior. People talk about defensive behavior a lot, and snakes hanging on to defensive behavior longer than they think it should. That can be another clue that a snake's not entirely comfortable. Do you have enough hides? Most snakes, in my experience, they're fine with 2. You got 1 at each end. Substrate for burrowers is 1 big giant hide that they can go under. Some snakes like having a few extra hides where they can pick somewhere in the middle. But sometimes defensive behavior that lasts longer than you think it should is also an indicator that a snake isn't entirely comfortable. And it could also just be that you haven't socialized it well enough. And so, it could be eating, it could be how much time they're spending in different parts of the enclosure, it can be defensive behavior. All of these are clues that something is off with that particular snake. And observe and adjust is just a way of recognizing, paying attention to those behaviors, and being able to notice that, hey, something's different in this enclosure than over here. These king snakes are going back and forth, they're active. This guy I rarely see, and when I do see him, it's always in that one hide. That snake's telling you, I don't like what's going on at the other end.
Yeah.
I don't like what's going on at the other end of the enclosure. It's our job to figure out what that is, whether it's temperature, whether it's the hide that I thought looked great that the snake doesn't like. But there's something's off.
Yeah. There's sometimes snakes will go off feed too, because that's what they do. A lot of mountain kings, they'll stop eating in August and they won't eat the rest of the year. Some milks do that too, and so that's a behavior. That's an instinct a lot of time,
and it doesn't need fixing.
Yeah,
but it requires education. You have to understand male snakes in the spring.
Yeah, my Arizona mountain kings, they'll quit eating in August and some people would panic, and it's just like, it hasn't ate 3 months and now it's hibernation time, and I don't think they don't lose body weight that fast. They have a slow metabolism, so there's behaviors and characteristics of each species.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you have to recognize that as well.
And as you observe those behaviors year over year over year, you start to notice the pattern. And the pattern could be slightly different with each individual.
For sure.
But you start to notice, okay, this is a regular occurrence. This is something I don't need to fix. So yeah, that's a great point. Not all behaviors are fixable, but many of them are. And it's our job to figure that out. And I think in some ways we're losing that art of observation and behavior to care sheets. So treat care sheets as a starting point, and then, which is valuable, you need that starting point, and then rely on your snake's behavior to tell you where to go from there. And it's pretty easy once you get the hang of it.
Yeah.
And you'll start to identify, exactly what the snake's trying to tell you.
Just little teeny things.
Yeah. Oh, one final point. A lot of people have a tendency to always assume when a snake's not eating that it's too cold. Uh-huh. So they're bumping temps.
Bump down too.
Too hot can also be a problem.
For sure.
So if your snake is not eating and it's always at the cool end of the enclosure, guess what? It's too warm.
Yeah.
And so you may need to dial down that hot side. I think that's the number one change over maybe the last 10, 15 years in the hobby is we're keeping a lot of snakes cooler today than we used to.
I think people are learning that as a whole. I know some people they can't digest at 75 degrees. Oh, yes, they can.
Yes, they can. Yes, they can.
It just takes longer.
Yeah, it takes an extra day, but they
days.
But they can do it.
Some of these snakes will go digest a rat in 3 days, as where winter time it takes them 6 days.
Yeah. But I think that's an important point. It's not always the adjustment. You're not always going to make the adjustment in one direction. And I always recommend 2 degrees at a time. I see sometimes people making 5 and 7 degree adjustments. two degrees, see what happens. 2 degrees, see what happens. But remember that too warm, too cool, they can be equally troubling when it comes to eating.
One observation I noticed, like when I first started, and I had a breeding partner, we did this together, and we would have snakes, and we would get stressed that they weren't eating. I'm like,
yeah.
And I was like, I got this, and this one on you, this one on you. And so we would swap snakes to different houses or places, and also all of them they're eating. It's like,
yes.
Something changed.
Yes, the change in scenery, regardless of the specifics of it, was enough.
I don't know. Sometimes you don't even know.
Mm-mm.
Because your temperatures are similar. My room could have been in an attic, or this guy's could have been in a basement, and it just happens to do better in one or the other.
Yes. It could even be simple light patterns. These animals are triggered by a variety of things. A snake room with a window versus without. Just a different sense of time in the house itself. Lights coming on, going off, people's schedules throughout the day. Tiny things that we don't even really pay attention to can rock their world.
Yeah, I mean, and I would just, one recommendation is like, try to mimic their, what they're in the wild they would be doing. Like, it drops every night. Throughout the country, our temperatures drop, or throughout the world, nighttime drops. And so, I think having a nighttime drop is important. Try to mimic your wild animals, because it's all instinctual. A lot of it is, and that will get them fired up.
And don't be afraid to experiment. And when you've got that one problem snake, it's fun. It's fun to figure it out.
Oh, I love these tricky feeders, like gray bands. I love trying to work on them. I think it's a challenge, and I think it's fun, and I'm getting pretty good at it.
And you learn a lot. And the more you learn, then it makes it easier for the next one.
Yep.
Leave us comments. Let us know what challenges you've had with some of your snakes, and how your own observations and your own learning over time has made you better with dealing with those things. We appreciate comments and questions. Thank you.
Peace.